Hi, so welcome to SAP UI5 tutorial. So today in this tutorial we are going to learn what is component in SAP UI5. If you would have observed, the last tutorials, whatever we have discussed so far, in those all tutorials we are creating SAP UI5 project and then we are directly implementing the page, right? So we are trying, so in index.html we are creating the object of the page and then we are rendering in the content division, I can say. Yeah. So today in this tutorial we are going to learn something new called SAP UI5 component. Okay, so let's create a project first after SAP UI5. So here this one, give a name called component and then click next. A view is test XML, click next, finish. So now we created a SAP UI5 project. So instead of using this view, this view, so let's create a different folder structure here. Okay, so create, let's say, something called as org, and inside this edu, then create one more folder inside this ui. Okay, so inside this ui folder, so this is a folder structure I'm going to create. So if you would have seen here, so it is like a component. So inside this component we are having these two XMLs. Instead of using this predefined structure, I'm going to use this structure. Okay, so in case if you want to deal with a component in SAP UI5, there is something called as component.js you have to create with the name, right? So inside this UI, create a file called component.js. Okay, so see, obviously SAP UI5 application means there should be a views and controllers and CSS files, right, and fragments. So for that, so let's create a different folders, right? So for the views, you just create something called as views. Okay, so in case if you want to have a fragments, create a folder called fragments. So this folder contains only the fragments and this folder contains only the views and corresponding controllers. Okay, and in case if you want to have a CSS file, so let's go here and then create a CSS for this particular component. So now we are creating the folder structure, and in case if you want to develop one application with just a mock data, let's create a folder called mock data. Okay, so then obviously SAP UI5 deals with a JSON objects, so let's create data.json inside this mock data. So let's implement this one later. So we are just trying to create only the folder structure, right? So now how can we read this component from this index.xml? So if you see this index.xml, so we are just trying to read this particular XML view, right? So what is this? This XML, test.view.xml. So instead of that, we need to read this component.js. So that means the instantiation or initialization of the application should start from this component.js. So for that, we need to modify this particular script tag. So how can we do that? So instead of using, okay, so instead of using this predefined code or by default whichever the code generated, so let's do one thing, let's comment this code. Okay, let's comment this code, then this. So what you do is, so try to write a script tag like this. Okay, so if you can see here, okay, if you can see here, let's me delete some unnecessary stuff. If you can see here, so like this same script tag, so in here I have the script tag and id is the same id. So id, we didn't know, this is the same id, and then it's the same, src is the same, and then I'm just pointing to SAPM libraries, and the theme is blue crystal theme, and in here these two are I have introduced newly. Okay, so what is this? Data SAP UI XX binding syntax, it's a complex, and then resource roots, I'm just giving org.edu.ui, which is org edu ui folder. That is what I have created, right? So and then, so once you map this one, so then we need to get the component of this particular folder called UI. So we need to read this particular component.js. So instead of in here in this previous applications, so we were getting the view and then we are rendering at the content, right? So instead of taking this view, we are going to read this component. In case if you want to read the component, again there is something called as script by script. So we have to use that particular tag. Okay, so what is that? Script by script, and in here, so sap.ui.get core.attach init. So in this function we are using something called as shell, and inside this shell, so we are using app. App is an aggregation of the shell control, and then to this app we are giving this component container. So this, for this particular component container, we are giving a name arg.edu.ui. That means what? So this component container will look for component.js in this particular location, arg edu ui. Arg edu ui in the sense, inside this arg folder, ui folder, inside edu folder, inside this edu folder there is something called as ui folder. Inside this there is a component. So this is how we are trying to read this particular component. So now we are able to read the components. So let's go back to the component .js file and try to implement the component.js file. So in case if you want to implement the component.js file, there is something called as UI component which is already defined in SAP UI5. So in case if you want to see that, let's go here. Okay, so go to this UI component. So you can see here, so we need to create one class which extends this particular UI component. Okay, to do that, so what we need to do is, so there is a new way of implementing a function in SAP UI5. So let's see that one today. Okay, so this one. Okay, so in here, if you can see, so this is SAP UI define. Okay, SAP.UI.define. So in this we are going to give all the dependencies in here. So that means what? Before executing this function, okay, so before executing this function, the SAP UI5 will load all these dependencies first, and then it will try to execute this particular function. Okay, so then try to use a restrict. Okay, in case if you want to know what is this restrict, use strict, then obviously just go ahead with the Google it and then just try to understand what is that. Okay, so then now as we discussed before, we need to create one object which extends UI component, right? So to create that, let's use this, and we are just creating a component variable, and then inside this UI component is the one which is of type this. Okay, so we are getting this UI component, and then we are extending this UI component to this arg edu ui dot component. Okay, so component is our file. Okay, we are then just try to implement this. Okay, so what we are doing in here is we are extending this particular component. Okay, so now once we extend this component, let's try to implement this component. So in here, obviously, if you see this UI component, let's go back to the documentation and see what is the UI component. If you can go to this by ID something something, so every UI component will be having a metadata in it. Okay, so you have to provide the metadata. So let's search for the metadata. Okay, see here, UI component has a metadata. We are going to provide the metadata of our own component. Okay, so to provide the metadata to our component, then obviously use something called as, okay, metadata. Okay, so metadata, and then inside this metadata we are going to provide so many details. So let's see one by one. Okay, so metadata, so in this metadata, so we are going to provide what is the name of the metadata, and what is, sorry, what is the name of this component, and what is the version of this particular component. Okay, so and then let's say in case if you want to include CSS files or JS files, then obviously there is something called as includes. This one you have to give. So this is what it is, reading the style.css from this particular CSS file. Okay, so that means, and after that you can also provide something called as dependencies. So what are all the dependencies of this particular component? So either what is, so all SAP M libraries, all SAP libraries you can configure whichever you feel that required for this particular component. So once you are done with this, dependencies, there is something called as configuration. Okay, so you can also give some configuration of this particular um, um, component, I can say. Okay, so service configurations. So in here you can provide the name, data, and core URLs, and then mock data URL. So if you can see here, so you can use this. I'm using one more property of service config, so which is there inside a config object. So in here I'm using mock data URL. So this URL is org edu ui, the mock data. It is pointing to this particular data.json. Okay, like this, it is not mandatory that you have to use only these names, and you can use different names also. So this is an optional. So after that, so there is something called as routing. Okay, so maybe later in the next tutorials we are going to discuss what is routing. So for the time being, what you understand is there is something called as routing. Okay, so I'll explain what is routing in brief now. Okay, so if you can see here, routing is again an object inside this, and inside this routing, so we are going to give the configuration of the routing. So that means which kind of views we have, so where the views present. So views, we have XML views, and the view path is arc, edu, ui, and views, and target control is nav container. So in case if you want to, why do we use the nav container? So in case if you want to move from one page to another page, then obviously, yeah, as we discussed in the previous tutorial, we have to use a nav container. Okay, and then target aggregation is pages, and clear target is you should use false. Okay, and then roots. So here roots, here the pattern I didn't give anything, I'm just giving name and view name. So this is the name of the this you can give anything. So this is the view name, so this is first page I'm giving. So I'm gonna create a view now here. Okay, so go to the new and others, then type view. So SAPUI5 application view, and give here first page. Okay, first page, and then it is of type XML, and click finish. So now I have created a view here. So this is first page. Okay, title of the page is first page. Now go back to your component.js, and let's go ahead with implementing some other stuff. So now we are done with metadata, and then we are going to implement some init method of component. Okay, so to implement the init method, so what I will do is I'll just create one init method. Okay, so in case if you want to create a init method, so how can you give like this? Okay, so initializing method, and then here this method, this is the init method. So if you can see here, now we are done with metadata, and we are going to provide the init method of this component. Okay, so in case if you want to give the init method, so then component is object, so this one, so then use dot prototype dot name of the method equals to this function, and then you need to try to implement the init method. Since we are using the inheritance concept of SAP UI5, so that means what we are extending UI component control or UI component class to our class, so we need to execute the init method of component UI component class first. Okay, and then we need to write our code. So this is what is in which we can execute the init method of UI component, and then try to create write our implement our own logic. So in case if you want to get this metadata in here, then obviously so you have to use this dot get metadata. So since it is a variable, so you have, there is a getter for this, that is this dot get metadata dot config. So I'm just getting this particular object in here. So once you get this configuration object, what I'm trying to, why I'm getting over here, because to load the mock data, right? So now, so obviously in case if you want to set a model, so we were dealing with JSON models, right? So create a JSON model, and then so what you do is create a JSON model, and then try to load the data, so whichever is there in the mock data, right? So JSON model dot, there is a method called load data. So here for this we are providing config dot service config dot mock data URL. Config is pointing to this one, and config dot service config and mock data, that means we are giving this particular JSON, and then we are loading in here, and we are just giving some other parameters. Okay, so once we load this particular mock data, and then finally we are setting this model to this component without name. So if you can see here, this is the way of setting a model to the component or to the view or to whatever it is. So if you don't give any name, it will be like a default model. Okay, so in case if you want to set more than one model to a single component or a single view or a single container, you can set more than one model at a time to a view or to a component or to a container. So in case if you want to set more than one model, then obviously each and every model should have a different name for that. Okay, so maybe later we are going to discuss that concept. So I should have discussed this one in the previous tutorial, but somehow I forget. So maybe we can see this one later. Okay, so and SAP Wi-Fi has a very beautiful feature using which we can easily identify which device is accessing our application. Okay, that is called device model. Okay, so again, so what I will do is I'll create one more model. Okay, the same JSON model with some parameters like this. Okay, so JSON model, so in here is touch sap.ui dot device dot support dot touch. So that means if you, let's say if you access this particular application in the mobile, it will return true, otherwise it will return. So in here I'm just setting not touch. Okay, so here, so this is some beautiful feature of SAP Wi-Fi. So here we are just setting one model called device model. We created a model, JSON model, and we are just giving the name of the JSON model as device model. So in case if you want to set this device model to the view, or this, sorry, not view, to this component, then obviously we have to use something called as this dot set model, and then give the model and then give the name. Okay, so this is how we are going to give a name to this particular model. This is a named model. In case if you want to access this device model inside your component, then you have to use this particular device name, because you set the model with the name called so in here we have given a name called device. In case if you want to access this model in your component later, so we can use this particular name. Okay, so right, so once we are setting the model, so what we can do is, so we need to get the router. Okay, so we need to get the router, and then we need to initialize the router. Okay, so maybe for the first time when you look into this particular tutorial, you may confuse that what, because it's a new stuff, right? So just let's not confuse, but try to do one more times. Let's try to practice it, then you'll get used to this. Okay, so this is how, so once you initialize the router, so then obviously uh, you are going to execute the view, right? So okay, fine. So we will come to this point again later. So then once you are done with this implementation of this init method, so we have to implement the destroy method. So the way how the destroy method is there inside the views, in the same way there is a destroy method there is a destroy method in component. Okay, so since we are destroying, we are writing this destroy method in here, so we need to explicitly call the super class destroy method like this. Okay, so now, yes, so now in case if you want to create a content out of this particular component, then obviously there is something called as this one. Okay, component.prototype.create content. Okay, so you need to create the content of this particular component. Content in the sense, you need to render the component, right? So that means you need to show, you need to tell this component that what is the first view which you are going to execute, right? So here in this create content method, so what you can do is this dot view. So this, you are getting one anyways object, so variable, and then sap.ui.view. So you are giving id to this view, and then view name is this app dot view. So org.edu dot view dot, sorry, ui dot views dot app, and then type is XML, and then finally you are returning this particular view. Okay, so now finally return this component. Okay, so we don't have this app view, app view, right? So what you do is go here and then create something called as view. Okay, and give the name is app. It is of type XML. Okay, now what should be the content of this app? So this app should contain a control called app. It should contain a nav container. Okay, exactly to say it should contain a nav container. But if you can see here, I am giving app, right? So now let's see what is app. Okay, so let's go to the documentation and try to see app. Okay, so if you can see app, so sap.yum.app is a class which extends a nav container. That means what? App is a subclass of nav container, and nav container is again a control, right? So that means what? Indirectly we are using a nav container, okay, with the help of this app. Okay, so what we can do now here is, so that means what, so far we created a component, and inside this component what we did is, so we are just creating a content. So what is that content? So this is the ID, the content is this one, this is a view we are reading. So what this view contains? This view contains a simple app by app. Okay, I'm giving ID as nav container. Okay, so let's go back to the component again. So in here, if you see here, this is how we are going to implement the component. This is the component which I have. This is the metadata of the component. So the metadata of the component gives the data about this particular or information about this particular component. So let's say for example name and version and what are all the library, what are all the files it includes, and what are the dependencies of this particular component, what is the configuration, and then what is the routing mechanism of this particular component. Okay, so on this, in this routing we are going to specify which type of views you are using, where the views reside in your application, and then what is the target control is, what is the target control? Nav container. If you see here, this navigation, this one, and then what is that, go to this ID of this app should be equal. If it is not equal, then it won't work. Okay, so then go back to the component, and in here, so page by page, in here anyways we are giving here pattern, we are not giving anything. That means by default it will execute this page. So that means whenever you execute this particular uh, project, so then obviously the control will go to this particular init method. It will read all these things, and then it will go to this create content method, and then it will create the view object from this particular view. So that means this view, okay, this view. So once it creates this object of this view, and then it will go to the routing mechanism, routing. It will take this particular routing, and in here, so it will try to, so since we didn't provide any pattern, so that is the reason it will directly fetch this particular view, and then it will render this view inside this particular app container. Okay, so let's run this project. So let's see what is the output of this project. So to run this project, obviously give a right click, go to run as, and then select web app preview. Yes, so it may take a couple of minutes obviously, because now you can see the busy indicator. So let's wait. Yes, now you can see now the application is running. So then copy this and then go back to the browser and then paste it here. Now you can see the first page, right? So what I will do now is, so I'll go to this component.js. Okay, so instead of giving the, I will give something called as first page. Okay, just first page. So I have given a pattern first page. So now what I will do is, let's go back to the browser again and refresh this browser. Let's see what's gonna happen. See, are we able to see the first page? No. In case if you want to see the first page, then obviously you have to give that particular pattern. Okay, so what is that pattern? So you have to give hash followed by first page. Now you can see there is a first page rendered, right? So if you don't give any pattern, then by default it will consider the first page. So now I'm just removing this particular first page, and then I'm going back to the browser. Okay, I'm just refreshing this. Now you can see, okay, first page, since it is a first page, so if you can see here, there is a first page pattern we have given, but so there is no view for that particular this particular pattern in component.js. Have you seen? Okay, if you see here, there is no pattern defined called first page, so that is the reason it was not executing anything over there. So let's go here and then remove this and then use only index.html. Now you can see first page. right? So this is how we are going to implement a component in SAP UI5. So let's try to design this page. So as we discussed in the previous tutorials, we were using some simple form by simple form, and then we are using we are rendering some first name, middle name, and father's name, contact details, right? So let's try to implement the same in here. Okay, so in the first page, so let me go back to the Eclipse and go back to this page. Yeah, so now we are going to implement this particular page. In case if you want to implement this page, so as we discussed in the previous tutorials, so let's implement the form in here. Okay, so form content by content, and then here, so this is a simple form which I have, the basic information like first name, middle name, last name, and then some date of birth over here. Okay, date of birth and then contact number. So if you would have seen here, so here if you observe this, so value is the one which I am mapping to first name, and this is where this value I'm mapping to middle name, and the same way this value I am mapping to last name. That means I'm using something called as binding concept over here, right? So before that, let's clear these two errors. So what this error says is it is trying to find f, but it is not able to find what is this f in this particular view. So what is f? F is again a namespace which is pointing to a different library in SAP UI5. Yes, so give this particular two namespaces. What is that? SAP UI layout, SAP UI layout form. So now there is no error, right? So now go back to this component and then try to see here. We are getting the data from where? So mock data URL we have given. So this is the one which is pointing to this particular JSON. So I don't have anything in here, right? So go back to the component and then where we are using this URL. So search for this. Yes. So I am creating a JSON model. Okay, and JSON model. Yes, I am loading that particular .json data.json into this model, and then we are setting this model to the component. Okay, that means what? So let me go back to MS Paint. Let me open the MS Paint, sorry. So if you could have considered, this is an SAP UI5 component. Okay, so let's say if this is an SAP UI5 component, so this component has so many views in it. Okay, either you can navigate from one view to another view. Okay, so one view to another view, and this view to this view, and this view to this view. So like this, whichever the view you want, you will navigate to a different views. So at the same time, this particular component has something called as data, right? So something called as data, mock data. Okay, okay, so I am setting one model to this entire component. Okay, I am setting one model. Okay, so this is a model. Okay, this is a model, and this is a component. Okay, so that means what? For this component I'm setting one model. That means what? This component has this model, so whichever the view in this particular component will access this model. Okay, so the data is there inside this particular component, right? So that's why, so if you go back to this screen, so here I am getting this particular mock data.json, and then I'm just setting this model to this particular component. Okay, so that means whichever the view is there inside the component, so each and every view can access this particular model. Okay, so that too I just set a model without name. That means it's a by default, it's a default model, right? So if you go back to the first page, okay, if you go back to the first page, so here I'm using I'm mapping this input field to the first name, and then I'm mapping this in middle name, this input field name to this middle name, and then that means what? Somehow we need to load the data. Where from we need to load the data? So if you go back to this component again, so we are loading the data from this particular mock data URL. What is this mock data URL? This is the one. So this is the URL which is pointing to this JSON. That means what? In here we need to create a data. Okay, so save this. What you do is let's try to create only uh, few properties. Okay, like this. Okay, this is a JSON, right? So now I have created first name, middle name, last name, date of birth, and contact number, right? So now we implemented first page, and then we have provided data for the first page in a separate file called data.json. Okay, so now let's go back to this view and then just refresh this. See, yes, so the view got rendered, and then each and every field has been filled with the data which is there inside this mock uh, inside this data.json, which is there inside a mock data folder. Okay, let's say in case if you modify the name, let's say name updated, so here also updated, here also updated. Okay, save this and go back to the browser and refresh the browser. You can see updated, updated, updated. So now if you observe this, so if you take this MVC concept into the consideration now, okay, so we have the views. Okay, views are separate, and then controllers are separate. Okay, and then um, let me check. Okay, views are separate. Okay, and controllers are separate, and then data is separate, right? So views are there in something called as views folder, and then controllers are there inside the same folder. Okay, and then data is also there in a separate folder, but we are just bringing all these three files together, with the help of model, right? So that means model view controller. So a model is, that means there are three different logics. So three different logics, in the sense there are three different codes. So one is views and model and then controller. These are all three individual objects, I can say, and then we are getting all these three objects together with the help of MVC architecture. Okay, so let's say in case if you want to get the data back from this particular page, if you, let's say, provide one button, then click on that button, you will get this entire object at a time. Okay, so you will get what is it, this entire object. Okay, you will get this entire object at a time. So you no need to use this dot get view by id. Okay, this dot get view by id, this particular one, and then this one, and then this one, and you don't need to use this dot get view by id to get this one separate, what is that name, first name separate, middle name separate, and last name separate. So you don't need to use, so you can, because the model is mapped to this particular view, you can get the view so that you can get the model out of that. So once you get the model, you will get the complete data back. Okay, so this is how we are going to use SAP UI5 component in our applications. So this is an exact way of developing SAP UI5 application with the help of components. So whichever we discussed in the previous tutorials, just to understand what is SAP UI5. So maybe going further, we are going to use the same approach. Same approach in the sense what each and every SAP UI5 application will be having a component. From the component, okay, we are going to load, we are going to define all the metadata of the component. From the component metadata, we are going to we are going to render these views. Okay, okay, fine. So what this component contains? The component contains the total information about this particular component, like what is the name, version, and then what are all the files which we have to include, and all the dependencies of this component, and then configuration, and then routing. So which is very important. So maybe we're gonna have one complete session for the routing. Okay, so as of now we just understand, so this routing, and then this, and then this. So in case if you want to see what is the syntax of this particular UI components, let's go back to the SAP UI5 documentation and then search for UI component. Okay, UI component, and let's see metadata. Okay, control F, search for metadata. Okay, so get metadata, and it is going to return this particular object. If you can see this object, you can understand all these metadata. So you go to this new class, and example metadata. So you can search for example metadata so that you can understand what are all. So far we are configuring only these. You can also configure some other the objects inside this. In case if you want to know all these things, let's search in the Google saying that what is the skeleton of the metadata of the component, so that you will get the in detail information, and then you can go ahead with configuring this. But since it is a basic component component tutorial which I am creating, so that is the reason I have created only the basic SAP Wi-Fi component. Okay, that's it for this tutorial. So let's meet in the next tutorial. Maybe going further we are going to use the same approach, so it will be very handy for you to just if you keep practicing this, it will be very handy. So maybe for the first time if you say this, it will be a bit confusing. So but going further we are going to use the same approach, so it will be very easy. Okay, so thanks for watching. So let's meet in the next tutorial.